just a little bit more, I want to ask just a little more about reasons why you might be opposed to the death penalty. You kind of gave us a great overview, and I don't want us to go too far down this trail, but recently, of course, there was this big shooting in Omaha, and there may not be anywhere else more appropriate right now in the nation than Nebraska to talk about the cycle of violence and what sort of happens to us. And there's a lot of emotions with the people who got killed. And in this case, the killer, of course, took his own life, so he is not in the equation. But can you just talk about a little bit about that, how that sort of impacts the debate about the death penalty? Does it have any correlation?
Well, I think that we've seen that the death penalty is not a deterrent, and especially in cases where you find that the killer takes their own life. I think that shows us that their own life is not of value to them enough to prevent them from committing the crime because they took their own life. So the state taking their life as a result of it, I don't think that we can psychologically loop around and say that that would be something that would keep them from doing these types of crimes. And I think that also economically, we're putting a lot of money in on the back end trying to deal with the problems that we're facing with really a cycle and a culture of violence. So we're spending a lot of money putting people to death and keeping them in prisons for their entire life. Either way, both expensive, putting people to death more so. Whereas if we would invest earlier and have programs, working to help kids cope with a lot of the problems, because we do see a lot of these, larger killings going on with young people. If we were giving them tools to cope earlier and preventing the violence, rather than trying to prevent it by punishing the people who committed it before, I think that that's another big issue that we need to deal with. Is just economically, is it, more important for us to punish people or to try to really prevent these things from happening? And I think that probably the victims' families here would rather that this kid would have been, given more opportunities and given some of the tools that he needed to cope with the things that he was dealing with, rather than be thinking about whether or not he should be put to death if he were still alive. So I don't think that there's much solace for a victim's family in the the perpetrator of the crime dying as there would be as if we had just prevented the crime from happening.
Jill, I want to pull out something that you said, simplify maybe a little bit about this issue of deterrence. I mean, a lot of people, I think, view the death penalty as a deterrent of crime. That is, if I'm going to go shoot people, I could get killed, so then I'm not going to go shoot people. And what you're saying is that this young man probably didn't stop before he entered the mall and think, I might get the death penalty if I don't in my own life during this escapade, that he had already decided to go ahead and do this, even though we are a state with the death penalty. I just think that's an important point in this debate. Amy, some of the other reasons that people might be against the death penalty, can you elaborate a little bit? We've talked somewhat, and we've brushed over economics a little bit about this deterrence idea. Are there any other arguments?
I really think that, and it may not be a very scientific argument, but I don't know how to quantify this any better. It's such an outdated idea. When you look back at the history of the death penalty in this country, we used to execute people for property crimes. Stealing something could result in you losing your life. We executed people for blasphemy in the early parts of the colonial period of this country. So someone who spoke in a dissenting way or came from a perspective that they did not believe in the prevailing religious beliefs could be put to death. And then as you bring it up into a more modern era, we used to execute people for rape, which has become illegal now. We used to execute, in my lifetime, people who had mental retardation, and in my own lifetime, we've executed children. So in this country, you've seen the debate move as we keep deciding, this is not humane. Well, and this also isn't humane, and this also isn't humane. There's a point at which maybe we all need to take a step back and say, there may not be any way to try to characterize this as appropriate justice. We need to just say, it's not appropriate, we need to stop. In Nebraska particularly, it's illustrated so crystal clear by the fact that we are the last state that's using the electric chair as our sole means of execution. And we're using the same chair that was built for the state penitentiary when we began executing people by electric chair. So the chair was built, according to the historians at the state prison, about 1920. During that time period, child labor was still legal. It was illegal to try to form a labor union and gather together for workers' rights. And Jill and I would not have been able to legally vote. So it is so clear to me, if we are using an actual machine that is so outdated in concept, the idea of putting people to death is just as antiquated as the idea that we should not allow unions, that we should have children laboring, and that half the population should not be able to cast a ballot. It's, as I say, not a particularly scientific argument, but there's just such a visceral response to saying this isn't right. This is not something that we should be doing. And as we continue to move on our path towards more civilized behavior, we need to shed the death penalty.
What about lethal injection?
Lethal injection is, for a while there in Nebraska, looked like this was going to be the saving grace for those people who supported the death penalty. Electric chair, of course, is a very gruesome way to kill someone. And we've had incidents, both in this state and others, where people died in a very graphic, horrific manner. Lethal injection looked better because it's cleaner. The person is immobilized by one of the drugs. But nationwide, those states that went to lethal injection are having problems as their courts are starting to put in moratoriums, or their legislatures are starting to repeal the use of a lethal injection, both because it turns out it's not humane. Although there's a drug that paralyzes the individual so they can't thrash around, they're dying in great, great pain. And ironically enough, when we kill people in this country, we want them to not suffer too much while we take their life. But there's also now this interesting question of whether or not they need a doctor to participate, because they are administering drugs through intravenous injection, and whether or not there needs to be an anesthesiologist present. And of course, the doctor's oath of office says that they cannot harm another being. So you have the medical community drawing back and saying we're not going to participate, and judges and legislatures saying this isn't humane unless we can anesthetize someone. Lethal injection right now is almost in more turmoil and more trouble, I think, than the electric chair is, ironically.